2 years ago, my best friend Victor and I were hanging out on Halloween night. We were roommates living in a small house, both of us in our last year of college. Obviously, we were too old to do any of the normal Halloween things, but we still wanted to do something. None of our more creative ideas really sounded good, so we ended up deciding on just making cookies and watching a scary movie. It was only 8 p.m., so most of the grocery stores were still open. I got in my car and drove down to the store to pick up some cookies to bake, along with frosting and some Halloween-themed sprinkles. As I was in the aisle, though, I noticed a man staring at me from the other end. I didn't look at him directly, but I could see out of the corner of my eye that he was looking at me the whole time I was in the aisle. Being that it was a holiday, the whole store was mostly empty, so seeing this guy being creepy like that was really unnerving. I quickly got what I needed and walked away, checking out and getting in my car. By the time I was out of the parking lot and onto the main road, I'd already forgotten about the man in the store. As I drove, there were a few cars out. I guess most people had already checked in for the night. I pulled into my street and parked in the driveway. But as I got out with the groceries, a car passed by my house. They were going really slow, like maybe 5 miles an hour. The windows were tinted, so I couldn't see who was inside or what they were doing. But once they got past my driveway, they sped up and drove off, making it clear that they were purposefully going slow only by my house. It made me feel a little uncomfortable. I told Victor about it when I got inside, but he didn't seem to think much of it. We put the cookies in the oven and sat in the kitchen while they baked, talking about which movie we were going to watch, until the doorbell rang. We gave each other confused looks. Then Victor got up and went to the door. I watched from the kitchen as he looked in the peephole for a second, then opened the door just a few inches. I heard Victor say something, then a few seconds passed before he closed the door and locked it. He turned around, looking even more confused than before, and walked back to the kitchen. I asked who it was and what they wanted. Victor said it was some guy, but when he asked what he needed, the guy didn't say anything, so Victor closed the door. Apparently, he was wearing a cheap plastic mask, but from the other features Victor described about him, it kind of sounded like the man I'd seen at the store. I didn't know if it was just me being paranoid. I got up and went to see for myself, walking quietly up to the door and looking out the peephole. No one was there anymore, but as I stayed and looked, I saw a car parked across the street, the same one that passed by earlier, now sitting right in front of our house. Its lights were off, and it didn't seem to be running. I told Victor, explaining everything and getting him to come look at the car. But then there was a thud that echoed through the house. We stopped and listened, hearing it again from the basement. I walked over and opened the basement door, looking down the staircase as the thuds got louder until it went quiet. There was a moment before we heard the faint footsteps shuffling through the basement. I shut the door softly without making any noise, and Victor was already calling the police. The basement door didn't have a lock on it, so I was just pressing my body against it and hoping for the best. The muffled footsteps went across the basement and to the bottom of the stairs, where they stopped. As I listened, the suspense made me more and more scared. Victor grabbed my shoulder and told me to come with him as we ran to the front and out of the house. We quickly got in my car and drove a few streets down, then waited for the police to arrive. When they did, nobody was inside, but the basement door was wide open. In the basement were shoe prints coming from the window well that had been broken open. The car was gone, so the man had, of course, driven away. It seemed like he left as soon as he noticed we weren't in the house anymore, because he didn't take anything. Whoever that guy was had followed me from the store stalked us, and then broke in. We didn't know why he did any of it, but I just hope that I never have to find out.
If you hit that like button, there's a good chance someone else's spine will get tingled by these stories.
I'm 26, and this happened last Halloween. I live alone in a small house in a normal neighborhood, and every Halloween was always the same. A bunch of kids would come by for candy until around 7 or 8 p.m., then I'd stay up and watch whatever movies were playing on TV. I was never much for celebrating or partying. I actually just preferred to hand out candy and spend the night alone. On this day, kids started showing up around 3 p.m. and continued to flood in until 7. Then a few more groups slowly trickled in before I figured it was slow enough to start watching some movies. I set down the bowl of candy and went over to the couch, turning on the TV and looking for a channel that had a good scary movie on. I scrolled around for a few minutes, but was interrupted by a knock at the door. I put down the remote and opened the door, holding the bowl of candy in my hand. When I opened it, though, I was surprised to see a man on the porch. No kids anywhere, just a middle-aged man in regular clothes. It was unexpected, making me stutter for a moment before asking, "How can I help you?" The man looked at me, then looked behind me into my house. "Is Aaron here?" he said quietly. I asked who Aaron was, but the man didn't answer and continued to try looking behind me. I asked again, and he finally looked back up at me and said that Aaron was his son who was out trick-or-treating, but he'd lost him. Strangely, he said it all with an emotionless gaze, then turned around and walked away from the door. I watched him, puzzled at what just happened. The man walked down the sidewalk and then went out of view. I shut the door and stood there for a moment, collecting my thoughts. It was so bizarre, but something was definitely off. I got my phone and called the police, reporting a possible missing child as well as the man's strange behavior. I made it clear I didn't know anything for sure and just told the operator everything that happened, but obviously, nothing was going to be done unless something else came up. After getting off the phone, I checked out the door one more time before going back to the couch and finding a movie. It was one of the Scream movies that had started a few minutes earlier. During the movie, there were no more trick-or-treaters or knocks at the door. By the end of it, it was nearly 11 p.m., and I was just about ready for bed. I stood up and turned to get the bowl by the door, but my eyes caught a glimpse of a figure in the window across the room. By the time I realized and turned around, the figure was gone. I could feel my heartbeat in my chest thinking about it, like they'd been watching me this whole time. I slowly walked up to the window and peered outside, but didn't see anyone. Although I'd only caught a glimpse of them, I knew for sure that it was a person, so I was 100% horrified. I backed away and went over to the front door, looking out the peephole. Nobody was out there. Getting even more nervous, I turned back around and suddenly saw an object slam against the outside of the window, forming a huge crack in the glass. A figure stood behind it, looking over at me before running toward the backyard. I quickly dialed 911 again and stayed in the hallway, looking all around at the windows. But after a minute passed, and then another, whoever was out there had left. The police did what they could, but there wasn't much I could help with. It looked like the person had smashed a rock or a tool against my window in an effort to break in, but other than that, their intentions were unknown. I keep trying to find the connection between the two incidents, the one with the man on my porch and the one by my window, but there's no real evidence showing it was the same person, other than the unusual way he was acting and looking into my house. There were also no reported cases afterward of any children gone missing, so what that man was really doing at my house remains a mystery. It was 2018, and I was still in middle school at the time. My group of friends and I were really excited for Halloween, mostly because we knew this would probably be our last trick-or-treating since we were getting too old for it. Our school only had half a day, which was really nice, but we didn't meet up until 5 p.m. By then, the sun was starting to set, which got us all the more in the mood to go running around and get as much candy as possible. There were 3 of us, all just wearing black clothes and random masks we'd found a couple of days before. It was pretty low effort, but still enough to pass as trick-or-treaters. Anyway, we started by meeting at my house, then moved our way through the neighborhood. Our goal was to get to the other side of the neighborhood, where there were custom houses on a street where all the rich people lived. It was separated from the rest of the houses and quite the walk, but we knew they'd have to be handing out full-size candy bars. We stopped by most of the houses on the way there, taking us almost 2 hours before we got to the big houses. By then, most of the kids had gone home, and the sidewalks were mostly empty. It was late since we'd started a bit behind, but it wasn't so late that people would be going to bed or anything. As we walked up to each big house, though, we realized a mistake in our plan. All the houses were really far apart. It took probably 5 minutes of walking to each door, so we had to jog to every house just so we could get through them all in time. By the time we finished, the last few houses had all their lights off, and no more people were answering their doors. It was just past 9 p.m., so it was really dark out and really late. We all agreed it was time to go and head back to my house so we could watch some movies and eat some of the candy. But just as we began walking down the street, we saw a man walking toward us. It was way too dark to see what he looked like, but it was definitely an adult wearing a hood covering his face, and he was alone. It was just us and him on the road. We felt a little weird that someone would be walking around like that on a holiday where kids were running around, so we moved over to the other side of the road. As we passed the man, he watched us from the other side. He tried to hide it, but it was pretty obvious he was looking right at us. This was really weird behavior, and none of us wanted to stick around, but we were all exhausted from having to run from house to house over the past couple of hours. So we opted for just walking quickly and checking behind us to make sure we weren't being followed. After a few minutes, we felt like we'd put a good distance between us. But out of nowhere, my friend in front stopped abruptly, causing me to bump into him and stumble back. I jokingly called him a few choice words, but when I looked up, I immediately went quiet. There was a hooded man standing at the side of one of the houses ahead, hiding between the trees in the woods just outside the reach of the streetlights. All we could see was his figure, but from the looks of it, it had to be the same man we'd just seen. He was just standing there, as if he was waiting for us to get closer. We were all whispering to each other as we stood in the road and tried to decide what to do. But there wasn't much to decide on. There was only one way out, which was the way we were heading. So we kept walking, keeping our eyes on the man. As we got closer and closer, just about to pass him, he started quickly walking out of the woods and toward us. All of us started running, making a break for the trees on the other side of the road. We stayed together, running into the woods in the direction that we hoped would lead to the other neighborhood. The further in we got, the darker and more difficult to navigate it became, especially while running at full speed. After a minute or so, we realized that the man had either lost us or stopped following. We took a moment to collect ourselves, leaning up against a tree. Only a minute passed before we heard footsteps in the leaves somewhere out in the woods nearby. We silenced our breathing as best we could and listened as they slowly moved through the dark, eventually fading out. We waited a bit to make sure it was safe, then hurried out of the woods and made it back to my house. None of us had the nerve to call the cops, but we didn't see any other kids outside on our way back, so hopefully they'd already gotten home. We don't know what that man was trying to do, but chasing us into the woods and continuing to try to find us only makes it more terrifying. We stopped going out for Halloween after that, but I still get chills thinking about that night.
Thanks for listening. If you want to help build the True Chiller community, like, subscribe, and share.